Good morning. You're a lot more awake than I am today. My name is Katie Pereira, and I'm the Senior Manager of Conference Programming here at South by Southwest. We are so thrilled that you're here for this year's event. Before I get into why we're here today, I have a few housekeeping notes that Hugh forgot to mention. Typical. To celebrate our first day of the event, we have our South by Southwest interactive opening party tonight at 4th & Co. at 8 p.m. Also, as you may have noticed, there are a lot of people here. If there are sessions you're unable to attend due to capacity limitations, check the schedule for encore sessions of some of our most popular sessions. You can also keep an eye out for video recordings and audio recordings on our online schedule. Finally, we've partnered with Slido for Q&A this year. You can ask questions by clicking the Engage button in the South by Southwest Go app. And I know our next speaker is ready for some questions. Now, South by Southwest is a place to meet new people, to explore new opportunities, and to challenge the way that you think. And that's why I'm so excited to introduce our opening speaker this year, Simran Jeet Singh. As a boy growing up in South Texas, Simran confronted racism daily. At school, in the neighborhood, playing sports, and later in college and beyond. Despite the prejudice and hate that he faced, this self-described, turban-wearing, brown-skinned, beard-loving Sikh refused to give in to negativity. In his recently published book, The Light We Give, which, by the way, you can pick up a copy of in our bookstore and maybe even get it signed by Simran after the session, Simran explores how everyone can learn the insights and skills that have kept him engaged and led him to commit to activism without becoming consumed by anger, self-pity, or burnout. Please join me in welcoming Simran Jeet Singh to the South by Southwest stage.
Good morning. It's an honor to be here. I'm grateful, truly. Growing up about an hour down the road from here, I would not have ever dreamed that I'd one day be speaking at South by Southwest. Part of that is because I'd never heard of South by Southwest. But a bigger part of that is for people like me coming from the margins of society. So often spaces like these don't feel like they're for us. And so for that reason, I'm thankful. Thankful for the progress, thankful to all of you for the work you've done to create change. And I'm also hopeful that we'll continue driving this change because there's still so far we all have to go. I'm not quite sure why my parents thought Texas would be the place to raise turban-wearing boys. I was born and raised in San Antonio, as with my 3 brothers. And it's home. Texas is home. And part of what I want to share with you all is, and this may be a bit surprising, our childhood was amazing. It was fantastic. We had friends. We have friends, some of whom are here today. We had classmates and teachers and teammates and coaches and neighbors. I mean, we had community. And in so many ways, it felt like the American dream. In so many ways, we saw ourselves as typical Americans. And at the same time, we knew that many Americans didn't see us as typical, that we were seen as foreign, as outsiders, as threats. And one of the challenges we had to figure out early was how do we deal with the racism that came our way in a way that helped us move beyond the daily outrage and the frustration and the anger. The first time someone called me a terrorist, I was 11 years old. It wasn't far from here. It was at a soccer game. The referee came up to me during the pre-game equipment checks and said, "I know your people like to hide bombs and knives in that thing. I need to check it." And I was a kid. He's an adult. I wanted to play. There were no other adults around. I didn't know what to do. And so I made a decision. I stepped forward, I put my head forward, and I let him touch my turban, pat it down. And I was so mad at him. But I was even madder at myself. I played, I went home, and for a couple of weeks, I couldn't get over it. Why did I give in to this person's racism? Why didn't I stand up for myself? And after a few weeks, I forgave myself with a commitment, with a promise that the next time something like this happened, I would stand up. And it wasn't long before the next situation arose. I was on the middle school basketball team, and we were play fighting in the locker room after practice. And a friend of mine made a racist joke. I let it go. People laughed. It was fine. And then he reached across and pulled the turban off my head. And again, my fist clenched. I flashed back to the soccer referee. I remembered that promise to myself. And I just jumped up and I started punching him. And it felt like all the anger and frustration for years that have been building up came pouring out of my fists. And our teammates separated us. We went to the sink and washed up the blood and so on. And I picked up my gym bag and went home. And again, I was angry and frustrated. And I was also confused. Because when I gave in to the soccer referee, I wasn't happy with my response. And then when I fought back like I promised I would, I still was upset. And I knew in this moment, with these challenges that I'd be facing for the rest of my life, I knew that I needed a different kind of response. Fight and flight, the two most natural responses that come to us in these moments, they don't give us the satisfaction that we need. Not with the daily provocations that we all face. There has to be a different way of engaging so that we don't walk away always feeling so outraged, so angry, so frustrated. So I started to look for an answer. I started to look for a middle path. And I want to share some incidents in my life, 2 incidents in my life, that have really shaped the way that I've been able to think about this, both of which draw from my personal experience as a Sikh, growing up with daily racism, and also the wisdom that I've drawn from Sikh philosophy that I think has answers for so many of us with some of the most vexing questions. How do we find light when everything feels hopeless? When the world feels like it's so dark, like there are no answers? How do we love people who don't love us? How do we find the humanity in people who don't see our humanity? It's a tough question, and it's not one that our society is doing a very good job of figuring out. The most formative moment for me came when I was in 4th grade. We went to a roller skating rink in San Antonio. It was my older brother's 5th grade class party. So here comes my mom, an immigrant to this country, with 4 boys in tow. My older brother was in 5th grade, I was in 4th. Next brother was in 2nd and kindergarten. Okay, my poor mom. And we walk into this roller skating rink, and the manager comes running over the moment he sees us come in. And he's shouting. He says, "Get out of here with those damn rags on your heads." And it's not the first time we'd encountered something like this. We knew enough that we'd rather let our mom handle it than deal with it ourselves. And so the 4 of us went to the side, and our mom went and had a conversation with the manager. And after about 5 or 10 minutes, I'm getting impatient. We all are. Our friends are skating. We want to hang out with them. And so I go over to my mom. She has her back to me, and I pull on the back of her kameez, her shirt, her long shirt. I pull on it, and she turns around, and she's crying. And I'd never seen her cry before. In 4th grade, I just start crying too. And that's my response. And she grabs me across the shoulder and she says, "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" I said, "Well, the same reason you are. This isn't fair. They should let us skate." And she says, "Well, actually, that's not why I'm crying. I'm crying because we're so lucky." And I take a step back, right? Like, you must not understand what's going on here. What is there to feel lucky about? And she says, "Well, I told your classmates, I told the teachers, I told the parents what was going on, and they've all agreed to walk out together." And I can't describe to you what that feeling was for me as a child. Maybe you're feeling a fraction of that right now. For me, it was the first time in my life that I felt like people really cared for me. That my friends who really wanted something were willing to give that up because they cared about me more. Right? It isn't the biggest sacrifice in the world, right? No one's life was getting saved. But for me, as a kid, think about that feeling. I mean, I can feel it right now, what that meant. I didn't know the word solidarity then, but I felt it. And in the years since, as I've reflected on this experience, I keep thinking about how that moment comes to be. Right? Here's a situation where a mother should feel so hopeless. I have kids about the same age now. That's my biggest fear, honestly. What do I do when they're being discriminated against, and it happens, and I don't have the power to protect them from it? I mean, she should have felt hopeless. And somehow, instead of falling into the fight or flight binary that we so often do, right? Easiest thing would have been to say, "Let's go. Let's get out of here." Another easy thing would have been to fight with the manager. She could have done that for hours. But she found a different way. She invited her community in to care. She didn't tell them how to show up, but she gave them the opportunity. And that middle path of engaging, of embracing the difficulty and finding the light within it, it changed the entire experience. Not just for me, also for my friends. I mean, think about these kids who now have the opportunity to understand what it's like to live in my shoes, who now understand they have the power to step up for someone. And there's another lesson in here too for me that I think about a lot. And that is by embracing this middle path. She's able to create optimism in a moment that feels hopeless. In our tradition, we refer to this as Chardikala, eternal optimism. It's not about sugarcoating. It's not about escaping. It's not about toxic positivity. It's about recognizing the challenges for what they are and stepping into them with your values and finding the light within those moments. I want to share one other incident that really, really changed my life in so many ways, but picks up on this theme of how we find light in the midst of darkness. When I was 18 years old, senior in high school, the semester had just started. I went to a big public school outside of San Antonio. And as we're walking through the halls one morning, we're hearing the news that there had been a terrorist attack in New York City. And my friends and I, we ran to Miss Strong's classroom. That was our teacher, our favorite teacher. And we watched TV. She had the news on. We stood there. Half an hour goes by. We're just in shock, like many of you. And after about an hour, the news anchor announces they have a suspect. And it's a man whose name I'd never heard before, Osama bin Laden. And then they show his image on the screen. And my heart sinks. My classmates and my friends are all looking at me. Not in the kind of judgmental, we think you did something wrong kind of way, but with a clear understanding that my life was about to become more difficult. And they were right. My life changed forever on that day. That afternoon, my mom came early to school to pick up my brothers and me. We didn't talk, got in the car, went home, and for the first time that I can remember, we locked the door as we walked in. And it was a very strange experience because as Americans, we're watching the news trying to understand what had happened to our country. And as Sikhs, we're also trying to follow the news about the racist backlash and seeing what is happening to our community. And it becomes crystal clear to me in this moment that before I may have been the other, people might have not known about me or worried about me. Now, I was the enemy. And I knew that because people told us that. The death threat started that afternoon. First by phone, people calling in, and then people driving by. During the days, we would watch the news trying to understand what had happened to our country. In the evenings, we would huddle by the phone and listen to accounts of people in our community being attacked, assaulted, murdered. And as an 18-year-old, I'm trying to make sense of something that we all struggle with in some way. What do you do when the way you see yourself is so different from how other people see you? For me, this was an extreme version of that, right? As I tie my turban on my head every morning, I'm thinking about my values as a Sikh. I'm thinking about love and service and justice. But now, when people see me and they see my turban, they think about the exact opposite. They see hate. They see terrorism. They see misogyny. They see homophobia. I mean, all these things that are so different from how I see myself are shaping my reality. After a few days, my dad comes in and he says, "Wow, aren't we so lucky?" And again, as with the few years before, I look at him confused. What is there to be lucky about? We're being attacked as Americans, we're being attacked as Sikhs, we're locked up in this house, we have nowhere to go. What kind of fortune do you see in any of this? And he says, "Well, didn't you notice? Didn't you notice that your neighbors have been coming by to give us food? Didn't you notice your teachers have been calling to check in on you? Your classmates, your coaches? Didn't you notice?" And that's all he said. It was a short conversation. But the lesson has stuck with me forever. Because what he was communicating to me in this moment was, we have choices about how we see the world. Our impulse is to focus on the negative, right? And that's a survival instinct. We need that. In times of difficulty, we focus on the difficulty. And we forget to notice the good, which is also all around us at the same time. We have a choice. We can live with constant fear. We can live with constant unhappiness. We can live with constant frustration. or we can see the world for what it is. In this moment, for me, that meant recognizing that there is as much beauty in this world as there is a world. That there's light always all around us. And this is, I think, the beauty of the metaphor of light. The sun is always shining. It depends on where you're positioned. Are you able to see it? What's your perspective? And this simple lesson of noticing, of gratitude, of seeing people for who they are, rather than just focusing on what scares us, what troubles us, where the problems are, it's completely shifted my perspective. I believe people are good. I've developed a habit that I want to share with you, a habit of noticing, of observing. When times feel tough, when it feels like people are terrible and there's no hope for the world, I walk outside and I watch people. Not sugarcoating, not only looking for the good, but just looking at who people are. And what I found time and time again is that people are good. We just have to remind ourselves. We have to notice, right? It's the person who notices somebody trying to walk into a door at a store while pushing a stroller, and somebody opens the door for them. It's someone, I saw this morning as I was walking up, somebody dropping their papers, someone else noticing, picking it up and running to show them, to give them their papers back. I mean, these actions are around us all the time. We just don't notice. And what you'll find, what I found, is that what we describe as random acts of kindness actually aren't that random. They're all around us. They're constant. They live with us. And learning to see the goodness, learning to see the light, learning to live with gratitude, that's a choice that we can all make every day. It begins with a practice, and it takes us into a way of living that can help us taste the sweetness of life, even with all the challenges as we embrace them. It can help us see the light, even with the darkness as we take it on. In our tradition, we refer to this as mithas, sweetness. Sweetness is always around us. Grace in some other traditions, blessings. And my challenge for you all as we move into the session today, into the conference, make that choice. Find the goodness, find the light. Thank you. Thank you. I wish my students would clap when I talk to them. So, at this point, it's my privilege, honor to invite Laurie Santos to the stage. She's a professor at Yale, the host of the Happiness Lab, which is a wonderful podcast. If you don't listen to it, you should. But I'll invite Laurie on, and we'll begin a conversation. Thank you.
So, you were fantastic. That was amazing. Simran, first of all, thank you so much. I wanted to start our conversation with some gratitude, not just because you brought me to the opening session at South by, which is like, dream, this is fantastic, but just because you just so courageously shared your story. It's like so filled with vulnerability, so filled with these awful moments, but you still had a path to finding the light. And so can we get one more round of applause, just gratitude for this fantastic story? But as a nerdy professor, and a nerdy professor who focuses on happiness, I couldn't help but start by wanting to kind of dig a little bit more into these principles that you talked about. Because I think it's one thing to try to find the light generally, but sometimes that can, as you've talked about in your book, this can be really, really hard. And one of the things I was struck by reading the book, which you should all immediately get after this, The Light We Give is amazing, and you should all read it if you haven't already bought it on Amazon while you're listening to Simran talk already. But one of the things I want to do is to dig into some of the Sikh principles that you talk about in the book, and some of the philosophical principles specifically that I think helped you get through some of these events. And the first is one that you mentioned in your talk already, this idea of Chardikala. Maybe just expand on what that idea is a little bit, and then we can talk about kind of how we get there, because it's pretty hard.
Yeah, sure. So Chardikala is this, and very nice Punjabi pronunciation, by the way.
Thank you. I practice a little bit, yeah.
It's a term that comes up in our daily prayers, and honestly, for the longest time, I couldn't understand what it meant. I mean, I understand it as a concept, and I think we all do, right? Optimism. It's not a new concept. But I think the question for me becomes, how do you find optimism in a way that doesn't brush off the difficulty? And that's the real challenge. Because so often in a context of difficulty, what we might say is, let's find the silver lining. And I think that's one strategy or one form for embracing optimism. But what we often do when we're silver lining things is saying, let's push aside the difficulty. Let's ignore it. Let's not deal with it. And I think culturally, especially here in the States, that's our approach when we're looking for something that's positive. It's in a binary with the negative, right? We say it's one or the other. And what I find with Chardikala that I find so powerful in this concept is our lives don't exist in binaries. As much as we want to be optimistic, challenges come to us constantly. And my story is, and the one I shared today is about race and racism in Texas, but like we each have difficulties and challenges. And so how do you live in a way that honors the difficulty of your life and also balances that with what is also beautiful and powerful and optimistic? And I think that to me is the balance that we try and strike in Sikh philosophy.
So this idea of kind of finding the balance, that the good can be there with the bad, I think is related to another principle that you talk a lot about in the book, this idea of ik onkar, this idea of radical connectedness. So walk me through what this idea is and kind of how it plays out in some of the work that you talked about today.
Yeah, part of my experience, so I grew up with these ideas in Sikh philosophy. But what I've learned is these teachings and wisdom in general, it's not exclusive to any community, right? Wisdom is for all of us. And this idea of ikonkar, I think, is a really powerful antidote to so much of what ails us as a society today. It's this concept that begins with a foundational understanding that the world is interconnected. And again, it's not exclusive to Sikh wisdom. In Buddhist philosophy, you might call it interdependence. In Islam, you might call it wahadat al-wujud. I mean, in Christian mystical tradition, there's so much of this everywhere. But part of what I really find powerful in this is you begin from a place of recognizing that the entire world is interconnected, that there's something that binds us all together, not just as people, but the entire world. And one of the phrases that we say every day is "Sab mein jyot jyot hai soi," that the same light is in everything, in all. Part of the philosophy is if you can start to see this light and experience the light within every interaction, then you can actually start to feel connected with the world in a way that creates inner peace, so that then whatever is happening, you're seeing the goodness within it, you're seeing the light within it. And I think that part of the approach, it's so different from how we live today, which is focused on, do I like this or do I not like this? Do I agree with this? Do I not agree with this? Do I appreciate this or do I? It's such a different way of living, and I think it's something we could all embrace and benefit from.
And so one part of this idea of radical connectedness is that you have to make sure that you're feeling the connectedness not just to the people around you or the people that are being good to you or when times are great. Like, you also have to feel connected to people who are doing terrible things to you. Like, you have to cultivate compassion for people who really suck, right? Who like morally suck, right? And so I'm curious kind of how you do, like, how do you find the light in that divine connection in the midst of these really traumatic situations when people are really intentionally directing hatred at you?
You know, share. So there are a couple of strategies we all know, and then I'll share one that I've learned that's been transformative for me. So one that we know is that you get to know people, right? People who you disagree with. In the social sciences, we call it contact theory. If you know people who are different from you, you will be less bigoted towards them, prejudicial towards them, so on. I think everybody in the room would be familiar with this basic concept. Another one is you find common ground with people you disagree with, right? So you and I may, let's say we have very different political views, religious views, racial backgrounds, and so on, and I'm like, oh, you like basketball, I like basketball too, right? We have something in common and you start building a relationship along those lines, right? These are both tactical strategies. But I want to share one with you that was very unexpected for me and one that I really needed. In 2012, a white supremacist entered a Sikh place of worship in Wisconsin and massacred the congregation. And you know, I live in New York now, I was there at the time. I was so upset at this person who couldn't control the hatred in his heart and ended up inflicting pain on so many people. I mean, I was just so mad at him. And, you know, I tried the approach of connecting with him on the basis of, you know, what we would call some kind of contact theory. I went to the white supremacist message boards. I'll tell you, that didn't make me feel any better. I mean, it just didn't work. And then I tried the other strategy of let me see what I have in common with this person. So I read a lot about him, as much as I could, and that didn't work either, right? Like, I just felt like I had nothing in common with this person. And it took me a while. And I was committed to this because I was recognizing that my anger had no consequence on him, right? He was already dead. He killed himself at the end of the massacre. My anger was only hurting me, and I didn't want him to have that over me. And so I kept working at it, and the unexpected turn really came when I stopped looking at him and started looking at myself. And part of what I learned was, by recognizing my own imperfections and seeing that I also, I mean, I didn't have the same extreme views that he did, but I also had racist ideas inside of me that I'd learned growing up in this country. It was really uncomfortable to notice that within myself, but once I started to, I mean, honestly, once I started to, it became easier for me to understand where he was coming from. You know, starting to ask the question of, what happened to you so that you could have these feelings towards people, that you can inflict this kind of pain, enabled me to humanize him in a way that I honestly didn't want to, but I knew that I needed to. And ultimately, it was about finding this light that we shared and that starting point of connection.
And one of the things I love about this story is that it really, again, wound up not being about doing anything to help him or forgive him or to deal with the action at all. It was about doing something that helped you, right? It helped your emotions. It allowed you to live without anger. And I think we can forget this in the context of these awful events, that these choices that we make that you talk about, they can be the kind of thing that we can do to wind up feeling better ourselves, to kind of take care of ourselves in this special way in the midst of awful stuff. Yeah,
it's such a good point, I think, because part of what I'm seeing in this culture right now is the daily outrage and the anger and frustration. I get it, and there's a lot to be angry and frustrated and outraged about. But part of the challenge is our approach to it so often is others-oriented, right? If you talk to people, and I do this with my students all the time, like, why should we care about other people? Why should we help other people? The answer is always outward looking, right? It is because we have a privilege and then we have a responsibility, and so we owe that to other people. And I agree with that. I think that's important. But part of the story that we're missing, I think, is something can happen to you internally that provides you the nourishment and the satisfaction and the happiness you're looking for. And so much of our, I think, cultural joylessness, right, the emptiness that we're feeling is because we're just not making that move. And part of what I want to say is, it's not that hard of a shift for us to make, right? We're already doing the action. We just need to bring the intention behind it and to say, this is others-oriented and it's for me too, and I'm going to take happiness. I'm going to serve myself as I'm serving other people. And I think that could change so much for us.
That's great. And I love this idea of serving ourselves, which also fits in an interesting way with this idea of radical connectedness, this idea that there's the divine in all of us. Because I think when we think of the divine in all of us, we think of all the other people out there, but we're not often focused on self-compassion, like giving ourselves compassion when we're kind of pissed off at ourselves. And so how have you been able to apply this concept of divinity in everyone to yourself in very tough moments with self-forgiveness?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, so part of what I want to offer is that there are three parts to this, right? There's seeing the light within the world all around us. There's seeing the light in one another. And then the hardest part for me, honestly, is seeing the light within myself. And one of the challenges has been, how do you enter into this sincerely without becoming egocentric, right? What I don't want is to reproduce the same kind of supremacy that's creating all these problems, right? So I don't want to see myself as being better than others. And that's so much of how we think, right? Like, to honor ourselves is to denigrate someone else. We create a zero-sum game. And I think part of the promise of this approach is it doesn't have to be that way. And it feels unfamiliar because we don't really see much of it around us. But there's a possibility here, right? We know people who have lived this way, where they say, I am as much a part of you as you are a part of me. The first step that I took in this regard actually came from a Christian theologian, C.S. Lewis, who says, humility is not thinking less about yourself, it's about thinking about yourself less. Mm-hmm. And that changed so much for me, because until that point, I wasn't really sure what the balance was. I didn't really understand how to live with humility without centering myself. And so that was a big one. The other one that I want to share that comes from Sikh scripture, we say, Man tu jyot sarup hai, apna mool pehchan. And it's this really simple, I mean, all of these are simple concepts. This is another one. But it says, oh my mind, you are an embodiment of that same light. And then it turns into a demand, right, or a command. Apna mool pehchan, recognize who you are, recognize your origin. In a way, it's like the same thing that racists say to me, right? Like, go back to where you came from. But this is the idea, right? Like, we are light. If we're trying to see that in the world around us and in other people, then it is imperative that we also see ourselves that way, right? And then we can actually create this sort of interconnectedness that we're aspiring for.
And the key, I think, is not just seeing ourselves that way. Another kind of insight that comes from Sikh philosophy is this idea that you need to recognize these principles that you have about yourself, like, oh, I'm radically connected, there's divine in me, but then you need to find ways to put that into practice, right? And this is especially true when you're trying to live your principles. And so I know that in the book you talked a little bit about kind of coming to terms with this, not even in terms of these big kind of awful racist incidents, but just, am I living my moral principles in the day-to-day in terms of my priorities and so on? Let's talk a little bit about how you became aware of that and what you did to kind of correct the misbalances.
Yeah, this is probably, out of all the stories that I'll share here, this is probably the most uncomfortable for me. But I share it in the book, and I'm happy to share it with you all. Basically, and I think we all do this in a way, and so it's maybe a little more comfortable. When the pandemic hit, I live in New York City. My wife is a physician. She was treating COVID patients. We had 2 really young girls, and I was with them all day. I was working with them, and as we started to come out of the pandemic, I started to recognize that there was a big gap between what I said I was about and how I was living my life. I had always said that family is the most important thing to me, and that was my number one priority. And as we started to come out of the pandemic, I started to realize that all my time was being spent doing things aside from what I said I actually cared about, right? Like I was at work all day. When I wasn't at work, I was thinking about things related to work. And when I had opportunities to do what I actually said I cared about, I wasn't making those choices. And so I developed this really simple reflection, because it's so hard sometimes to see yourself truly from within your own life. And so I just developed this practice of saying, okay, if an alien comes from outer space and observes me, what would they notice? How do I spend my time all day? And based on how they see I spend my time, what would they go back and report as my priorities? And so that simple exercise helped me actually see more honestly, right, in a way that was unvarnished and uncomfortable for me, where my actual priorities were as opposed to what my aspirational priorities were. And that diagnosis helped me to develop an intervention for myself. Like what am I going to change so I actually live the way that I say I want to?
Which I think is so important. It's again, the thing you've talked about is you have to notice. And sometimes when the things are uncomfortable, especially about ourselves, it can be really hard to notice. So that's fantastic. But I'm running over time, and so now it's time to look at all the questions that you have sent us. And so I think they're supposed to, in the magic of South by Southwest, appear on the screens for me, and I'm going to pick from some of your questions. If you haven't submitted them yet, now's the time to do it, because they are soon to appear on the screen here. And so now that I'm seeing them, one of the cool questions that just came in is a question by Ram, who asks, how do you engage with people that simply won't engage in an open conversation, people who have their mind made up? I think I've met some of these people, Ram, so this is an important question. Yeah.
Yeah, I've met a lot of these people, and part of what I would say, and those of you who come from the margins would have some experience to offer here too. So maybe you'd know what I'm getting at. There's no formula for any of this, right? There's no formula for when I'm walking down the street and someone's yelling racial slurs. It's not like, I've dealt with it for 38 years. It's not like I know exactly what I'm going to do in every situation, right? Every moment is different, and you need to take into account what are the conditions. One thing that I would say is, even when I don't necessarily feel that I can change people, I often still engage. And part of that is coming in with the humility to understand that you're not going to change everyone's minds, right? And that it's not necessarily your job to do so. And I think today, and especially with younger generations, we've put that pressure on ourselves, we put that burden on ourselves to say, if we don't fix everyone's opinions, then we've failed. And I just don't think that's true, right? There are far greater people who have walked on this earth, who have done incredible things, who have not been able to shift everyone's opinion. I don't think that's a fair bar to set for yourself. I think that's one. I think the second thing I would say to this is my approach has shifted quite a bit, actually. And as you'll have noticed in my remarks to you all today, I didn't start with facts. I didn't start with information. I started with stories. And I found that if the end goal here is to create empathy across difference, then we have to open ourselves up to one another so that other people will open themselves up to us. And that's the winning strategy, I think. Right? If you think back to that story about my mom at the roller skating rink, that's what she was doing with those other parents and the teachers. Right? She opened herself up to them so that they could then respond in a way that was appropriate and less defensive, right? More clear-hearted, more open-hearted. And so I think that's another shift that I've made in my own life in terms of engaging with people who come in as perhaps less open-minded that I would like.
That's lovely. And so another question we have comes from Sarah, which I think is an important one. This is one that I get from my students a lot when I talk about compassion. Sarah asks, some activists I've spoken to say that there is a time for hope and a time for anger, like anger, angry emojis, like pissed off. Do you ever think that anger is useful personally or within movements? Like when can we go to anger? And I'll add on, how does that interact with compassion?
Yeah, I love the question, and I'm going to invite you to share some based on your research too, because I know there's something you've thought a lot about. Yes, I think there's a place for anger. So let me be a professor for a second and contextualize. Yes, I think there's a place for anger, and anger is also an incredibly corrosive force. And so if we don't channel it appropriately, it could eat us up from the inside. And I've experienced that personally, right? So what does anger look like within justice? Part of what I want to offer is that there is a possibility of grounding appropriate anger within love. In my view, love is the foundation of all justice. Cornel West, Christian theologian, he says, justice is what love looks like in public. So if the goal is justice, that's my goal, then love is the foundation. Anger is a natural human emotion, right? It's part of who we are. As I said before, there's a lot for us to be angry about. There's a lot of injustice. And so the question for me becomes, how do we channel anger in a way that feeds love, sustains love, and also produces love? That's the question, right? So I think anger is going to be there, but I think orienting it and channeling it in a way that gets us to where we want to go, both personally, right, in our inner lives, but also publicly within our social context and our political context. I think that's the place for anger within our world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that fits so nicely with what a lot of the empirical research shows, right, is that, anger is there, but it can sometimes be counterproductive for the action that you want to see in the world, right? Take a simple case of I'm trying to park in the parking lot and someone steals my space. I could fly off the handle and scream and get really upset, but that might not get me to where I want to go, which is I just want to, as smoothly as possible, get into the store and go shopping, right? That's a very simple parking lot case. When you take that to the realm of social justice, you see the complexities, right? Because sometimes anger might be needed to, get you out there, get you protesting, get you fighting for what you need. But sometimes the anger might be counterproductive, and the spot where it can be most counterproductive is within yourself, right? If it's not allowing you the bandwidth to do what you need to do to get out there yourself, then that winds up being counterproductive. The key, though, is that you have to make a choice, as you keep talking about, but that choice can be really hard. We can regulate these things, but we need to kind of get up there. And I think the next question from Kano kind of deals with this, right? Which is not just how do we kind of find compassion and regulate anger, but how do we teach our kids to do that? So Simran, I'm going to call on you as a parent to talk about this one. So how do we teach our children to maintain and sustain compassion and love, and to overcome all the darkness of hate that's in the world? How do we train our kids to find the light out there?
This is the question of my time, of our family right now. Particularly because we are facing a mental health crisis like we've never seen before. Depression at the highest rate we've ever seen. Suicide rates unprecedented. And as a father, that is the biggest concern. How do you raise kids in this world where there is so much difficulty, where they feel the difficulty viscerally? And what do you give them to protect them against that? Right? How are we equipping them? And the best answer that I know is actually the same answer that I have for all of us. And part of what I want to offer is actually what I've shared with you all, which I have found to be profound. It's actually really simple, to the point where my young daughters from the age of 5 could understand it. right? And the way we talk about this in education is you simplify without oversimplifying, right? You scaffold their understanding, and the starting point really is, hey, that light that you have in your heart, that's the same light that everyone has in their heart. Starting point, right? It is helpful for all of us, right? We forget that as adults, but it's helpful for kids too. And I think the next step really is to be honest about what happens when people do bad things. And from a very young age, right? The way that we talk about it is you separate the action from the person. Somebody might do something terrible, but they're not terrible. Easier for a kid to understand because they don't know how terrible people can be. Harder for me as a 30-year-old as I'm thinking about this white supremacist who massacres people, and I'm like, that guy did terrible things. I really feel like he's terrible. But I need to figure out how to get beyond that. And so I think really we can be better with our kids about being honest and taking them more seriously and scaffolding their understanding, starting from a place of recognizing the interconnection in the way that we all are talking about. And also then preparing them for the difficulty, even though our impulse, and my impulse, is to shelter them from it. Right? I don't want them to know how hard life can be, but in an age-appropriate way, we need to introduce them to these concepts so that they don't end up like our college students who come into the classrooms and feel like the rug has been pulled out from under them, right? Who are facing the difficulties of our world for the first time. So that's a thought for me as a parent.
I love that answer, that it really does involve the hard thing as a parent, which is to allow your kids to see the nastiness of the world. But if you do that right, you can sometimes impart really important lessons. And I wonder if you'd share a story that I loved from the book about your parents teaching you a really important lesson about kindness. This was one that is not a person who is Sikh. I was sort of shocked by about your birthday presents. It's a sort of radical lesson about kindness and equality and sharing.
Yeah, actually, my daughter just had her birthday a couple weeks ago, and we did the same thing.
Did you do the same practice?
Yeah,
Whoa, okay.
We're doing something similar.
If your daughter's in the audience, I'm sorry. Spoiler, bad birthday, yeah.
Yeah, it's a simple practice, but it was, you have a birthday party, you have fun, people bring you presents, you keep 2, and the rest are given away. And it's a reminder that, the world isn't about you, even on your birthday. And in this country, we can become very self-centered in these ways. So it was just a really simple way for my parents to remind us that, yes, let's celebrate you and have fun and you enjoy your day, but it's not just your day. And the way that we celebrate is we give. In our tradition, the term we use is vandachakna. And I hadn't thought about this in this way, but it's a nice corollary. You give and then you receive. Vanda is to give and chakna is to take. So you give and then you receive. And part of this, what I've learned through this philosophy is generosity is actually, it feels like you're giving to support other people, but again, you internally are nourished by this and you receive so much that is not empiricized through giving. So, yeah.
Sorry for your daughter, but she's going to learn so much. But now to wind down, because the clock is ticking in a very aggressive way, I want to end with one last question here, which is from Thomas. I think something we all want to know, which is, now as an adult, what makes you stop and say, aren't we lucky? You told some lovely stories of your mom and your dad saying, aren't we lucky? What should we all today be lucky for, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Thomas. It's part of what I want to share is, as much as I am on the stage as someone who has lived these practices, it's also a lifelong journey. And so probably the things that I'll share with you that I take for granted are very similar to what you all do. Yesterday, I was on my flight over here. I was traveling with a friend who just had a concussion in a bike accident, and she was telling me I'd never really thought about my head safety and my brain, but now I'm cherishing it, right? It's only been 2 weeks, but And she said that, and I was like, oh shit. Like I've never, I've never really thought about how lucky I am to have physical safety, of course, but like your brain. So it's so often these little things that, we just normalize life. Health is probably the easiest thing to take for granted. And then we go through a pandemic and you say, wow, there are some real life-changing consequences for a lot of people in ways that I never could have imagined. I think here's the thing that I find so tricky about this, right? The thing about privilege is it's the hardest thing to notice. It's easy to notice what you don't have. It's so hard to notice what you do have. And so part of what I think is the gift of any kind of introspective spiritual practice is that it can help you see the things that you wouldn't able to otherwise see. And so for me, what is it that I take for granted? Probably every privilege that I have, right? The clothes I'm wearing, the travel that I did to get here, the health of my kids, it's everything. And it just requires a conscious practice to get to a place where you can actually feel the gratitude. But I think just to close that out, that's the promise of gratitude, right? If you can learn and develop the habit of noticing, of appreciating, then your experience is falling into that choice of like, I'm so happy, I'm so lucky, rather than feeling down all the time about what you don't have. So, yeah.
That's great. Well, I think one thing that we all are very lucky for is the fact that you have shared all your wisdom with us, and in a time that can feel really dark, have given us all a little glimpse of the light. Please join me in thanking Simran Jeet Singh one more time.